Before this season started, everyone, including me, thought Jon Gruden was crazy. When he came to Oakland a year and a half ago and promised to remake the Raiders offense in his image, I don't think anyone expected that plan to include trading away Amari Cooper, signing Richie Incognito, and then both trading for and cutting Antonio Brown before he could even play a snap. A big chunk of Gruden's moves made no sense to us outsiders. We all thought he was nuts. And other than Raider Nation themselves, I don't think anyone really expected this whole thing to work. But 3 months later, it has, and it's worked spectacularly well at that. Yes, Oakland's offense may only be ranked 13th in the league in terms of yards per game, but it's how they get those yards and win those games that really matters to me, because stylistically, this is probably the most quintessential Gruden team ever. There's a reason why the Raiders are second in the league in number of 10-plus play drives, even while running a relatively low number of plays overall. They grind you down with the run game over and over, they move the chains on third downs with short, rhythm passes that get the ball out quick, and on their trademark long, suffocating drives, they almost never go backwards. That last point, by the way, not going backwards, is really the key to everything working as efficiently as it does, because just getting anything on any given play, no matter how small the gain, goes a long way towards Gruden's ultimate goal, creating manageable third downs for Derek Carr. The Raiders have had the fewest plays in the league that resulted in a loss of yardage, whether by run or pass, and they've also had the fewest plays in the league that resulted in no gain, too. Not only that, but they've also allowed the second fewest number of sacks as well at only 12. So really, other than their one major weakness, which is committing way too many penalties, this offense is always moving forwards and always setting up shorter and shorter third downs. That's why the Raiders' average third down distance of 6 yards is also the shortest average in the NFL, even with all of their penalties, and that makes Carr's job that much easier throughout the game. I look back to the Raiders' victory over the Lions a couple weeks ago, and that was kind of the blueprint of all blueprints for how this team wins. Their defense couldn't really get many stops in that matchup, just like they haven't been able to get many stops during most of the season, Chargers game notwithstanding. But because the Raiders were able to control the ball, be efficient, and protect their defense by keeping them off the field, they won. Josh Jacobs carried the ball nearly 30 times at over 4 yards per clip, and he was phenomenal. He took hit after hit after hit and just kept dishing out punishment in return, and because he once again acted as the engine of the offense and almost never lost any yards, it gave Derek Carr a lot of very manageable third downs exactly like this one. This is a 3rd and 3 opportunity about halfway into the second quarter, and the mesh call that Oakland ran here out of a bunch is probably their best bread and butter passing concept. They love mesh, they love shallow crossing routes, and they especially love using bunch formations and motions to easily identify coverages before the ball is snapped. That's actually the reason why they motioned Trevor Davis into the bunch too, because they wanted to use that motion to see if anyone followed him into the bunch, which would tell Carr exactly what the Lions were doing and make it a little bit easier for him to make adjustments at the line. As soon as he saw that trail defender move across the formation, that was the red flag he needed to make a check to mesh against man. For reference, in their lingo, the call was Indy, and of course, as you would expect, it worked beautifully. Darren Waller got sprung wide open by the rub, the ball got out way before the blitz could get home, and 21 yards later, Waller set this offense up at midfield. 7 plays after that, Jacobs punched it in to retake the lead going into halftime. This right here is exactly what Gruden wants. Pound the rock, set up short yardage third downs, and let Carr get the ball out underneath quick to keep drives going. It's a very simple game plan, but it works, and as soon as defenses go with equally simple game plans to try to stop it, Gruden usually does a pretty good job of dialing up a counterpunch to get them moving again. Take that Detroit game as an example one more time. After those shallow crossers and rubs kept eating them up in short yardage situations, Matt Patricia decided to start only rushing 3 and dropping 8 into coverage on third downs. The goal was to take away all of those quick passing windows with a ton of defenders underneath, which would then force Carr to hold the ball long enough for the edge rushers to get home, or worse, try to make a very tough throw into a tight window that could be intercepted. It was a really solid plan that gambled on the Raiders' tendency to not throw much down the field, and at least early on the call did have some success. But like all great offensive minds, if you show one coverage too many times to Jon Gruden, eventually he's going to make you pay for it, and that's when the Raiders really started to move the ball. This is late in the third quarter on 3rd and 6, and again the Lions are dropping 8 into coverage to try to set a trap for Carr and cover up the quick game. The Raiders used motion to get into that same bunch again after all, so it was a pretty solid bet that they were going to go back to those tried and true crossing routes underneath like they did earlier. But this is at the point in the game where Gruden gets aggressive and starts breaking tendencies to generate big plays. He's not calling that same mesh concept again, he's dialing up a variation of a dagger concept to Tyrell Williams that takes a long time to develop. Longer than the Raiders' usual comfort zone at least. But because the Lions had dropped 8 into coverage so often in this game, Gruden knew that it was coming, so he felt comfortable calling that longer developing play since he was going to be seeing a 3-man rush that would be unlikely to move Derek off of his spot. It was a great call and was perfectly executed to open up that deep middle window for Williams, and it both sprung Oakland for another much needed chunk play while also making Detroit think twice about only rushing with 3 guys again. But Gruden's craftiness didn't stop there, because one play later, he went into a formation that you really don't see much from them at all, empty, and he did that in order to spread the Lions out and get them into this middle of field open look in a no-huddle situation. He was trying to keep Detroit on their heels with tempo, he didn't want them communicating and moving around during any pre-snap motions, he just wanted these safeties to split, and he wanted them to stay split so that this seam ball could come wide-ass open up the middle. Gruden even made this read as easy as possible for Carr by putting both his tight end and his running back out wide to give a formation indicator on the defense. Both Waller and Richard drew corners in coverage instead of safeties and linebackers, which of course was a signal for zone coverage, and right then and there Carr knew that he had him dead to rights. At this point, he's only got to read one defender on the play now, this strong safety, because the route combination has that safety caught in a jam between the go outside and the seam inside. If the safety reads the seam against the mic and moves over to bracket it, the go ball is therefore at worst a one-on-one in the end zone with minimal risk. But if the safety splits himself between the go and the seam and tries to play both of them at once, that seam is there all day long with inside leverage, and they don't have any way of stopping it. No matter what, the Lions were screwed here before the ball even touched Carr's hands, and that kind of no-win situation is why I love Gruden's play calling so much this season. He hits you with so many body blows over and over that these huge left hooks are devastating when they land. The defense is exhausted from being on the field for so long, they've spent 3 entire quarters getting the absolute shit beaten out of them by Josh Jacobs, and now while being exhausted and beat up, they've got to worry about Gruden calling something tricky for a chunk play that they weren't prepared for. This is not a new formula at all, I want to make that very clear. In fact, it's quite the opposite of new. But I think that's why this Raiders offense fascinates me so much. It's a wonderful mix of old school, beat 'em up, West Coast offense principles, with a few crafty new school play designs thrown in a few times a game to keep defenses off balance. And it all blends together perfectly. When the Raiders aren't shooting themselves in the foot with penalties, they're incredibly hard to get off the field, which in turn makes them a very, very dangerous team overall. I mean, look at it this way, how many other organizations could go through the hardest strength of schedule in the league at 539, go on the road for 5 straight weeks during that stretch, including a trip overseas to London, come into the season with the least experienced receiving core in the NFL, and the 4th youngest roster overall in the league, and still be 5-4 and in the mix for a playoff spot? Does the national media have any idea how insane that is that John Gruden pulled that record out of his ass despite everything the Raiders have had to go through? I mean, if that's not Coach of the Year type stuff, I don't know what is. The Browns have encountered even less adversity than what the Raiders have dealt with, and they buckled like a cheap picnic table despite having objectively way more talent on their roster. Leadership, vision, and game planning makes a difference, and the record in Cleveland versus the record in Oakland is a perfect illustration of that fact. Truth be told, I don't think there's a single team in the NFL that the Raiders are not capable of beating. Unlike a lot of other ball clubs, they have built an identity. And identities are a very powerful thing in this league. They know what they are, and they know what they're not. And I respect that they don't deviate from that identity for any reason. They don't show up to the field on Sundays to mess around and get into shootouts because they don't want to be in a shootout. They show up to punch you in the mouth and take your lunch money. That's it. That's all they know how to do. John Gruden may have been crazy to rebuild this offense into his ultimate love letter to the 90s, but honestly, look at the team he's running. Look at the fan base, the city, and what that organization has represented for decades. If you're going to be the one to lead Raider Nation back to the glory days of being the schoolyard bully, getting a bit crazy along the way isn't a bad idea. If anything, to me, being crazy is the most important part of the job.